August 21st, 1968. A quiet country lane outside Florence, Italy. Antonio Lobianco and Barbara Lucio sit in a parked car, hidden from the road by tall grass and darkness. They've chosen this spot carefully, a secluded lover's lane where Barbara's husband won't find them. The windows are cracked open to let in the warm summer breeze. They don't hear the footsteps approaching through the grass. The first gunshot shatters the night. Then another, and another. In the back seat, Barbara's 6-year-old son wakes to the sound of his mother dying. He huddles in terror as the killer fires methodical shots into both bodies. When silence falls, the child waits. Hours pass before he stumbles to a nearby farmhouse, covered in his mother's blood, and whispers, "My mama's dead." There was someone who knocked. What investigators didn't know that August night was that they had just encountered a killer who would terrorize Florence for nearly 2 decades. A predator who would claim at least 14 more victims. A murderer so calculating, so patient, so driven by a compulsion authorities couldn't understand, that he would become known simply as Il Mostro, the Monster of Florence. And the most disturbing part? He was just getting started. Welcome to Deadly Intent, the podcast that examines the darkest criminal cases through the lens of intent, because intent is what separates accident from murder, passion from premeditation, justice from revenge. I'm Carmen Carrion, and today we're traveling to Tuscany, Italy, to examine one of the most chilling unsolved serial murder cases in European history. The Monster of Florence terrorized the Italian countryside for 17 years. Targeting young couples in parked cars with ritualistic precision. But what makes this case truly exceptional isn't just the brutality, it's the forensic consistency, the psychological profile that seems almost impossible, and the investigation that spiraled into conspiracy theories so wild they overshadowed the actual murders. This is a case where multiple people were convicted, imprisoned, and released, where prosecutors pursued theories involving satanic cults, secret societies, and international conspiracies, where the true killer, if he was working alone, displayed such control, such methodical planning, and such specific paraphilic obsession that he represents one of the rarest types of serial offenders. Let's examine the Monster of Florence. Not the mythology, not the conspiracy theories, but the actual crimes. The actual evidence, and the psychology of intent that drove someone to kill again and again for nearly 2 decades. Intent doesn't lie. People do. Before the Monster of Florence officially existed, there was the murder of Barbara Lucio and Antonio Lobianco on August 21st, 1968. Barbara was having an affair with Antonio while her husband worked night shifts. They had driven to a secluded area in Castelletti, taking Barbara's 6-year-old son along. He slept in the back seat while the couple spent time together in the front. Someone approached the vehicle in the darkness and fired a .22 Beretta pistol through the window. Both victims were shot multiple times. The killer used Winchester Series H ammunition, a detail that would become critical years later. Barbara's husband was immediately suspected and arrested. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to prison for the murders. Case closed. Except it wasn't, because 6 years later, while Barbara's husband sat in a prison cell, the monster struck again. Same weapon, same ammunition, same methodology. September 14, 1974. Pascal Genticore and Stefania Pettini, both 19 years old, parked in a cemetery parking area in Borgo San Lorenzo, about 40 kilometers from Florence. They were young, in love, and looking for privacy in Stefania's white Fiat 127. The killer approached the car sometime after 10 p.m. He fired through the driver's side window, killing Pascal almost instantly, with shots to the head and body. Stefania tried to escape, pushing her door open and stumbling into the darkness. The killer pursued her. What he did next would become his signature. the element that separated these murders from ordinary homicides and revealed the psychological compulsion driving them. Stefania's body was found 90 feet from the car. She had been stabbed 96 times. The killer had carefully positioned her body on its back, legs spread apart. He had used a knife to mutilate her genitals and groin area, removing tissue from her pubic region. A vine branch had been inserted into her vagina. The medical examiner noted something crucial. The mutilations were performed with skill. The cuts were clean, deliberate, purposeful. This wasn't frenzy, this was ritual. Investigators realized two things immediately. First, the ballistics matched the 1968 murders perfectly. Same gun, same ammunition, even the same firing pin markings. Second, they were dealing with someone whose primary motivation wasn't the killing itself. The shooting was just the method. The intent was what came after. 1981. The monster had disappeared. For 7 years there were no attacks. This hiatus is psychologically significant. Serial killers, especially those driven by sexual compulsion, rarely stop voluntarily for this long. Either the killer was incarcerated for another crime, physically unable to continue, or exercising extraordinary self-control while his compulsion rebuilt. Then on June 6, 1981, Giovanni Foggi and Carmela Danuccio were found dead in their car near Scandicci. Both had been shot with the same .22 Beretta. Carmela's body had been removed from the vehicle and mutilated in the same manner as Stefania Pettini. Genital mutilation, precise knife work, ritualistic positioning. The monster had returned, and this time he wouldn't stop. October 22, 1981, Stefano Baldi and Susanna Cambi, both 26, were shot in their Volkswagen van near Calenzano. Susanna's body was dragged from the vehicle and mutilated following the now established pattern. June 19, 1982, Paolo Mainardi, 22, and Antonello Migliorini, 19, were murdered in their car in Montespertoli. The killer broke his pattern slightly. He was interrupted by a passing car and fled before the completing of the mutilation ritual. This detail is important. Even under pressure, with potential witnesses nearby, he had attempted to fulfill his compulsion. The need was that strong. September 9, 1983. The bodies of Horst Wilhelm Mayer and Jens Uwe Rusch were discovered in their Volkswagen camper van near San Casciano. This attack seemed different. Both victims were male. Had the monster made a mistake? When investigators examined the scene, they understood. Rusch had long blonde hair. In the darkness, the killer had likely assumed he was looking at a heterosexual couple. When he realized his error after shooting both men, he didn't perform any mutilation. He simply left. This revealed something crucial about the killer's psychology. The mutilation wasn't opportunistic violence. It was the purpose. Without a female victim to fulfill his ritual, the murders held no meaning for him. July 29, 1984. Claudio Stefanacci, 21, and Pia Rontini, 18, were murdered in their car near Vicchio di Magello. Pia's body showed the familiar mutilation pattern, but with a horrifying addition. The killer had removed her left breast and pubic area, taking the tissue with him as a trophy. This escalation indicated the killer's compulsion was intensifying. He was no longer satisfied with the ritual alone. He needed physical souvenirs. The final victims were Jean-Michel Cravachilli, 25, and Nadine Morio, 36, both French tourists. On the night of September 7th through 8th, 1985, they were camping in a tent near San Casciano when the monster attacked. Nadine was shot and stabbed while sleeping in their tent. Jean-Michel was killed trying to escape. Nadine's body showed the familiar mutilation pattern, removal of her pubic area and left breast. The day after the bodies were discovered, prosecutor Silvia Della Monica received a package. Inside was a piece of Nadine's breast tissue, along with a section cut from her purse. The message was clear. The monster wanted recognition, wanted to taunt authorities, wanted to prove he was still in complete control. This would be the last attack attributed to the Monster of Florence. Afterward, silence. No more murders, no more messages. Just an unsolved case that would spawn decades of investigation, conspiracy theories, and wrongful accusations. Now let's examine the psychology driving these crimes. What was the monster's intent? What compulsion drove someone to kill in this specific ritualized way for 17 years? The Monster of Florence represents one of the most organized serial offenders in criminal history. Every aspect of his crimes demonstrates planning, control, and method. He exclusively targeted young couples in isolated lovers' lanes. This wasn't random. He was hunting. He knew the locations where couples parked. He likely spent hours conducting surveillance, learning patterns, identifying ideal attack sites where he wouldn't be disturbed. The same .22 Beretta and Winchester Series H ammunition across 17 years. He maintained this weapon, preserved the ammunition, and never varied his tools despite law enforcement scrutiny. This speaks to extraordinary discipline. He struck in darkness and isolated areas, always ensuring he had time to complete his ritual. When interrupted once, he fled rather than risk capture. Control was paramount. Despite committing at least 8 attacks over 17 years, the monster left no usable DNA, no fingerprints, no witnesses who could identify him. This level of forensic awareness in the 1970s and early 80s is remarkable. The monster's primary motivation wasn't killing, it was the mutilation ritual. The psychology is complex. He shot his victims quickly and efficiently. The gunshots were functional methods to render victims unable to resist. His true intent emerged afterward during the careful, methodical cutting. Every female victim suffered genital mutilation. This wasn't generalized violence. The specific targeting of sexual organs indicates a profound psychosexual pathology, likely involving sexual sadism combined with a need to degrade or destroy femininity itself. The escalation to removing breasts as trophies represents increasing confidence and intensifying compulsion. He was no longer satisfied with the act alone. He needed physical reminders, objects he could keep and revisit. Bodies were arranged in specific ways. This staging served a psychological purpose. It fulfilled some internal script the killer was following, possibly recreating a fantasy, possibly symbolizing something from his past. His reaction to discovering both victims were male is illuminating. He didn't complete his ritual. The compulsion required a female victim. This wasn't about killing for its own sake. It was about fulfilling a very specific paraphilic need. Was the monster sexually dysfunctional with living partners? Many serial offenders who target couples and mutilate female victims suffer from profound sexual inadequacy. The crime becomes a substitute for normal sexual function. Consider his method. He watched couples engage in intimacy, then destroyed the woman while forcing her male partner to be present, even if already dead. This could represent rage toward women rooted in rejection or humiliation, envy of couples experiencing normal intimate relationships, a need to assert dominance over both sexes simultaneously, psychosexual dysfunction that prevented normal relationships. The ritualistic nature suggests this wasn't impulsive. He had likely spent years developing these fantasies before acting. The first murder in 1968 may have been his first opportunity, or there may be earlier victims we don't know about. What happened between 1974 and 1981? There are several theories. The most likely scenario, he may have been imprisoned for an unrelated crime. This would explain both the cessation and the eventual resumption. Upon release, the compulsion returned. Life circumstances may have changed. A marriage, demanding job, health crisis. Something temporarily suppressed his ability to hunt. But the underlying compulsion never faded. And then there's geographic relocation. He may have moved away from Florence, possibly committing similar crimes elsewhere that weren't connected to the monster case. Escalating control. Some offenders develop such rigid self-control that they can suppress urges for extended periods. only to eventually explode with renewed violence. The fact that he resumed with the exact same methodology argues against the burned-out theory. His compulsion was intact. Something external had prevented him from acting. The escalation to removing body parts and mailing them to authorities reveals evolving intent. By 1984 to 85, killing and mutilating weren't enough. He needed physical objects to relive the crimes, probably for sexual gratification. These trophies served as fantasy fuel between murders. Sending body parts wasn't just trophy-taking, it was message-sending. He wanted recognition. He wanted to prove his superiority over investigators. He wanted fear. This shift from purely compulsive offender to someone seeking notoriety suggests either growing confidence or increasing narcissism. He had evaded capture for so long that he may have begun to see himself as untouchable. The Monster of Florence investigation represents one of the most controversial criminal investigations in modern European history. Multiple suspects were arrested, tried, and convicted. Multiple theories were pursued. And through it all, the actual killer, whoever he was, remained free. Let's talk about the earlier suspects. Stefano Meli, Barbara Locci's husband, convicted of the 1968 murders. When the 1974 killings proved him innocent, he was released. But investigators theorized he might have loaned the gun to someone else, perhaps a relative or friend who committed the subsequent murders. Several Sardinian men in Barbara Locci's social circle were investigated, including Francesco Vinci and Salvatore Vinci. Francesco was actually in prison during some of the murders, which should have eliminated him. But prosecutors suggested a conspiracy, multiple killers using the same gun. The Sardinian theory collapsed under its own implausibility. The murders showed too much consistency in method, ritual, and psychological signature to be the work of multiple independent actors. The most infamous prosecution involved Pietro Pacciani, a farmer with a violent criminal history. In 1951, Pacciani had murdered a man he believed was having an affair with his fiancée, stabbing him 19 times while forcing the fiancée to watch. He had served 13 years in prison. Pacciani seemed like a viable suspect. History of extreme violence, sexual obsession, rage toward couples. In 1994, he was arrested and charged with being the Monster of Florence. But the evidence was circumstantial and questionable. Prosecutors built their case on his violent history, vague witness statements, the theory that he was part of a group called the Picnicking Friends, who allegedly killed together. In 1994, Pacciani was convicted. In 1996, the conviction was overturned on appeal due to insufficient evidence. Then prosecutors changed theories. Pacciani wasn't the killer. He was part of a group. Mario Vanni and Giancarlo Lotti, associates of Pacciani, were convicted as accomplices. Vanni maintained his innocence until his death in 2009. Lotti confessed but later recanted, claiming he'd been coerced. The Picnicking Friends theory contradicts everything we know about serial sexual homicide. The monster's signature was too consistent, too personal, too psychologically specific to be the work of multiple people. Sexual sadism of this nature doesn't occur in groups. The ritual was one person's compulsion, not a shared activity. As the investigation struggled, theories became increasingly outlandish. Prosecutors suggested the monster was killing on behalf of a satanic cult that needed female body parts for rituals. This theory was based primarily on the trophy taking and a few anonymous letters received during the investigation. Some theorists proposed that wealthy elites were commissioning the murders for occult purposes, with the monster as their hired assassin. Because the mutilations were performed with apparent skill, some suggested a surgeon or medical professional was involved. None of these theories fit the psychological profile. The monster wasn't killing for external purposes. He was killing to satisfy an internal compulsion. The mutilations weren't commissioned work. They were the fulfillment of his own paraphilic needs. In pursuing conspiracy theories and group kill scenarios, investigators may have overlooked simpler explanations. One man with a severe paraphilic disorder, about average intelligence, and extraordinary self-control. Someone who knew the back roads, the lovers' lanes, the patterns of young couples. Possibly someone who lived in Florence or the surrounding countryside for decades. Someone who understood evidence collection and took meticulous precautions. Possibly someone who followed the investigation closely, learning from each murder how to avoid detection in the next. The gaps between murders, the careful planning, the lack of obvious escalation and daytime attacks all suggest someone with responsibilities, possibly a family, who had to carefully compartmentalize his criminal life from his public persona. The .22 Beretta and Winchester Series H ammunition were the golden thread connecting all crimes. Who had access to this weapon in 1968? Where is it now? Finding that gun might have solved the case. Let's be explicit about the monster's intent, because it's critical to understanding these crimes. Sexual gratification through post-mortem mutilation. The monster's core compulsion wasn't murder. It was the ability to control, manipulate, and ritualistically alter female bodies. The killing was merely the method to acquire subjects for his ritual. Power and control. By targeting couples, he asserted dominance over both the male, killed quickly almost dismissively, and the female, the true object of his compulsion. This may have compensated for feelings of inadequacy in his actual life. Tertiary intent. Recognition and notoriety. By the mid-1980s, the monster began communicating with authorities, sending trophies, ensuring his crimes received maximum attention. He had progressed from satisfying personal compulsion to seeking public acknowledgement of his power. The gun and knife were tools, not fetish objects. He chose the .22 Beretta for practical reasons. Relatively quiet, small caliber that wouldn't immediately incapacitate victims before he could control the scene. Concealable. The knife was the true instrument of his compulsion. Young couples weren't random targets. They represented something specific to him. Possibly they symbolized a relationship dynamic he envied, resented, or desired to destroy. The fact that all victims were young and conventionally attractive suggests they may have represented an idealized normal sexuality that he couldn't achieve. The monster's intent was consistent across 17 years. Find isolated young couples, eliminate them quickly, perform ritualistic mutilation on the female victim to satisfy psychosexual compulsion, escape without detection. This consistency is almost unprecedented in serial crime. It suggests either someone with extraordinary psychological stability within his pathology, or someone whose life circumstances forced rigid adherence to a proven method. Why did he stop? After September 1985, the monster never struck again, at least not in a way that was connected to this case. Why? Theory 1. Death. The simplest explanation. He died of natural causes. Accident, or suicide. His age in 1985 is unknown, but if he had been active since 1968, he was likely at least in his 30s or 40s. Death becomes increasingly likely with each passing year. Theory 2. Incarceration. He may be in prison for an unrelated crime, just as he possibly was during the 1974 to 81 gap. Italian authorities may have the monster in custody without realizing it. Theory 3. Physical incapacitation. Illness, injury, or age-related decline made it impossible to continue hunting and killing. Theory 4. Relocation. He moved away from Florence to another country or region where similar crimes either weren't connected or weren't reported in ways that linked them to the monster. Theory 5. Intentional cessation. The heat of the investigation, the intense media coverage, the wrongful convictions, all may have convinced him the risk had become too high. Unlike many serial killers who can't stop, he demonstrated during the 7-year gap that he could suppress his urges when necessary. Theory 6. He's still there. The monster may still be alive in Florence, an elderly man living quietly with his trophies and memories, having successfully evaded justice for 40 years. The Monster of Florence became more than a criminal case. It became a cultural obsession that transformed Italian society's relationship with violent crime. Before the monster, Italy had experienced political terrorism, the years of lead, the Red Brigades, bombings and kidnappings driven by ideology. But sexually motivated serial murder on this scale was foreign to Italian consciousness. The monster represented something different, something that couldn't be explained by politics or organized crime or rational motivation. The Italian media covered the case with unprecedented intensity. Every attack generated headlines across Europe. Newspapers published diagrams of crime scenes, psychological profiles, speculation about the killer's identity. The term mostro became part of the national vocabulary. Parents warned children about the monster. Couples avoided lovers' lanes. An entire generation grew up with this unsolved case as background noise to their lives. Florence's tourism industry suffered. The city, known for Renaissance art and romantic landscapes, became associated with brutal murders in the countryside. Tour guides had to address questions about whether it was safe to visit. Hotels reported cancellations. The economic impact extended for years. But perhaps most significantly, the monster changed how Italian law enforcement approached violent crimes. Before this case, Italian police had limited experience with serial sexual homicide. They had no established protocols for crime scene analysis, victim linkage, or psychological profiling. The monster forced them to develop these capabilities, often learning through failure. The case also exposed deep flaws in the Italian judicial system. The wrongful convictions, the conspiracy theories given credence in court, the prosecutors who pursued increasingly bizarre scenarios, all revealed how a justice system under public pressure can abandon evidence-based investigation for expedient answers. The monster's legacy includes the information of specialized units within Italian law enforcement dedicated to serial crime investigation. Forensic psychology became recognized as a legitimate investigative tool. International cooperation between police agencies improved. The case, despite remaining unsolved, fundamentally changed how Italy investigates violent crime. The Monster of Florence case gained international attention in the 2000s when American author Douglas Preston became personally involved. Preston, researching the case for a book, found himself accused by prosecutors of being part of a conspiracy connected to the murders. This bizarre twist, an American crime writer becoming a suspect in a decades-old Italian murder case, brought global media scrutiny to the investigation's failures. Preston's book, co-authored with Italian journalist Mario Spezzi, The Monster of Florence, exposed the investigation's descent into paranoia and prosecutional overreach. It detailed how authorities pursued increasingly implausible theories, while ignoring basic investigative principles. The book became an international bestseller and introduced the case to audiences who'd never heard of the monster. The case has been featured in countless documentaries, true crime programs, and analytical studies. Criminologists use it as a teaching example of organized serial offending, paraphilic crime, and investigative failures. It's become one of the most studied unsolved cases in criminal justice education. But media coverage has also complicated the case. Sensationalized reporting, especially in the 1980s, created public panic that pressured investigators to make arrests, any arrests, to calm public fear. This pressure contributed to the wrongful prosecutions. The need to give the public answers overrode the need to find correct answers. The monster has appeared in fiction as well. Novels, films, and television shows inspired by the case. Some portray him as a supernatural figure, which ironically undermines understanding of the actual psychology involved. Others have used the case as a framework for conspiracy thrillers, again moving further from the reality of what likely happened. This media saturation has created a strange phenomenon. The Monster of Florence is simultaneously one of the most famous and least understood serial killers in modern history. Everyone knows the name, but few understand the actual psychological profile or the evidence that does exist. In discussions of serial murder, it's easy for victims to become statistics, names on a list, crime scene photographs, autopsy reports. But each of the monster's 16 victims was a full human being with dreams, relationships, and futures that were stolen. Pascal Gentacore and Stefania Pettini were 19. just beginning their adult lives. They had been dating for months. Stefania worked in a textile factory. Pascal was training to be a mechanic. Their families described them as inseparable, planning a future together. Giovanni Foggi and Carmela Danuccio had been together for years. They were older than most victims, both 30. They had chosen privacy in the countryside because Giovanni was separated from his wife, but not yet divorced. Their relationship was complicated, but their intentions that night were simple: to spend time together uninterrupted. Horst Wilhelm Mayer and Jens Uwe Rush were German tourists traveling through Italy. They were documenting their trip with photographs and journals. Their families back in Germany had no idea they'd become victims in a serial murder case. They died because a killer mistook one of them for a woman in the darkness. Nadine Moreau and Jean-Michel Cravichelli were French tourists camping in the Tuscan countryside. Nadine was 36, a mother. Jean-Michel was 25. They had come to Italy for beauty and history, and found instead a predator who had been hunting in those hills for nearly 2 decades. Each victim left behind grieving families who've spent years, in some cases decades, without answers. Parents who died never knowing who killed their children. Siblings who've aged into their own elderhood still seeking closure. The emotional toll extends far beyond the 16 people who died. The victims' families formed advocacy groups, pushed for continued investigation, and fought against the conspiracy theories that distracted from finding the actual killer. Some have expressed frustration that their loved ones became footnotes in a larger narrative about judicial failure and prosecutional misconduct. Important issues, but not what they sought. Remembering the victims as individuals, not statistics, is crucial. They weren't killed because of who they were. They were killed because of what they represented to a deeply disturbed individual. But that doesn't mean their individual humanity should be forgotten in the larger discussion of criminal psychology and investigative failure. The Monster of Florence case teaches us several critical lessons about intent, investigation, and the nature of serial sexual homicide. The ritualistic signature of these crimes, the specific mutilation pattern, the trophy taking, the victim selection, all point to a single offender with a highly specific paraphilia. When investigators abandoned this profile in favor of conspiracy theories, they lost the thread. Serial offenders driven by sexual compulsion maintain their signature because the signature is their purpose. The monster's method remained consistent because the ritual satisfied a psychological need that didn't evolve. He wasn't killing for money, revenge, or ideology. He was killing to fulfill a compulsion. That kind of intent doesn't shift to group activity or cult murder. Despite his success evading capture, the monster made choices that created vulnerabilities. He returned to the same geographic area repeatedly. He used the same weapon for nearly 2 decades. He took trophies that, if found, would be absolute proof of guilt. Somewhere, someone knows something. The gun exists. The trophies exist. Evidence exists. It's possible we'll never know the true monster's identity. He may have died taking his secret with him, but that doesn't mean the investigation was meaningless. Every suspect cleared, every theory disproven, every piece of evidence cataloged, all contribute to a narrowing field of possibilities. And finally, intent leaves traces. Somewhere in the records, the evidence, the interviews conducted over 40 years, the truth exists. The monster's compulsion was so specific, his ritual so consistent, his method so practiced. Someone that organized, that careful, that psychologically driven, likely exhibited warning signs elsewhere in his life. He wasn't invisible. He was just very, very good at hiding in plain sight. Somewhere, if he's still alive, the Monster of Florence is an old man now. He might be in his 70s or 80s. He might have grandchildren. He might live a quiet life, respected in his community, with a basement or attic where he keeps his secrets. Or he might be dead, his identity lost forever, his crimes a mystery that will never be definitively solved. But intent doesn't disappear. The psychological signature he left across those 17 years tells us who he was, even if we don't know his name. He was organized, controlled, driven by profound psychosexual pathology, and capable of extraordinary self-discipline. He was likely intelligent, employed, and stable enough to maintain a public persona separate from his crimes. And most importantly, he wasn't supernatural. He wasn't a monster in the mythological sense. He was a human being with a severe paraphilic disorder who chose to act on his compulsions rather than seek help or resist them. That's what makes cases like this so disturbing. Not that monsters exist, but that they look like everyone else. Next time on Deadly Intent, we're examining one of the most horrific family annihilations in American history. Ronald Gene Simmons, a former Air Force sergeant who spent Christmas week 1987 methodically murdering 16 members of his own family, including his wife, children, and grandchildren, before going on a workplace shooting spree that claimed 2 more lives. What drives a man to plan and execute the murder of everyone he claimed to love? What was his intent when he looked his own children in the eyes and pulled the trigger? And why did he fight so hard to be executed, telling the courts, "I've gotten over it"? Until then, remember, intent is everything. It's what separates accident from murder, passion from premeditation, justice from revenge. Intent doesn't lie. People do.